Good evening and welcome to Stories of the City, presented by the Department of History, the University of Sydney for History Week. This will be an evening of stories and poetry, of words about the City of Sydney. My name is James Dunk and I teach and write at the University of Sydney, a fine old sandstone university which sits on a hill above the city. It was founded to bathe the city in the fine old northern knowledge that had been planted here, under different skies, on different shores. But let's begin this evening's words about Sydney with better knowledge, that this city called Sydney rises, beautiful, terrible, from the country of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and sprawls relentlessly north through Wallamedigal, Gamaragal, and Ku-ring-gai country, west through Wandjal and Beedigal and into Dharug country, east to Gamigal and Guigal land, and southward through Gundungurra and into Tharawal country. The Sydney metropolis fulfills settler ambitions for this place, though it demands ever more space and resources. It also carries the immense moral burden of dispossession and the open scars of the knowledge of dispossession. Our course on the urban history of Sydney was called Sin City, and in it we wrestled with what it meant to be a settler city. Sydney has been associated with sin in many ways, but we asked whether it might be steeped in the original sin of dispossession. This continuing structural violence is the foundation of the city. I want to acknowledge tonight, as we strove to do in our tutorials and lectures, that this city called Sydney stands on the unceded land of the Gadigal people and other clans and nations. And together we pay our respects to past and present elders of the land we live on and speak from, and to those First Nations people present this evening. We do not own this city, and yet we find ourselves here, born into this history and these structures, or arriving in them and becoming part of them. Tonight, you'll hear short talks by students from Sin City, seeking to make sense of their place in this city and sharing what it means to them. There are many bodies of theory which study what it is, what a city is, which try to measure and categorize its parts to predict its futures. Town planning, civil engineering, public health, sociology, urban geography, urban ecology. When I took up the course last year, I began to think about how it is that historians come to know a city. And I came to see the place of narrative in that process. A city may be constituted and defined by its geography and its urban systems, but for those who live in it and those outside and those who come after, whatever a city is emerges from the stories that are told about it. And a city's history is written from whatever stories are told the most and the loudest and the clearest. And so after hearing other stories and narratives and lectures and readings, podcasts, interviews, I asked students to present their own stories about Sydney. They spoke in tutorials of how and why they or their families came to this city and how it greeted them when they did. They rehearsed generations of migration, cultural collision. Others talked about the whole city by talking about one place within it that had special meaning. A secret beach, a riverside walk, a suburban mall, a stretch of the CBD streetscape. Some spoke of their recent arrival, their first impressions, their later corrections. Others talked of what it was like to be a young Aboriginal person in a hostile city. Together we mapped the city through story, triangulating our experience, plotting the city through space and time. As these stories of Sydney gathered over semester, the overwhelming impression for me was of a diversity almost too great to make a whole. I began to wonder whether Sydney was anything at all, anything other than an accident, one enormous coincidence. Something without boundaries, natural or unnatural, without purpose or plan, without a telos or end. But somewhere within all that difference, the triangulation began to yield results. It was not that we saw the outlines of the city taking form, saw some submerged shape coming into a clearing view, but that these wildly different and incomparable stories, the imperfect fragments of an urban identity, became somehow in a shared space almost perfect together. Let's grant that a city is too big to entirely know, is a symphony rather than a song, is more than its silhouette. These stories bring the city into view as an assembly of actual people, stretching into the past and the future, people with some sense of belonging to one ungainly whole. Then the history of the city emerges through the stories told by its people, stories like those you'll hear tonight. We'll hear from 11 wonderful, creative, and thoughtful students: Angus Brasher, Michael Feeney, Rose Fitch, Georgia Fryer, Therese Lee, Grace Mitchell, Leah Perkins, Nafeesa Rahman, Nishita Sewak, Holland Tao, and Eloise van der Veen. And we'll hear a 12th story woven through the poems of Toby Fitch, who will read from his new book, Sydney Spleen, a book which John Kinsella describes in The Australian as a scrutinizing, self-excoriating journey through the contradictions of wealth and lack, of constraint and greed, to find a way of processing false political speak and the reality that strikes throughout the city and its suburbs. He tries to break free from his immersion in Sydney, writes Kinsella, while being almost literally trapped in it. Toby's a brilliant poet of the city, and we're so lucky to have him read for us this evening. I have my own stories of this city that are bound up with the family I was born into, stories of poverty and middle classery, alcoholism, depression, of reading and writing and swimming and walking. My siblings and I grew up in a quarter-acre block at the edge of the city, ringed by bush. Sydney, a distant thought, of tall ships sailing under a broken bridge, an art gallery, a set of statues and fountains, and towers and shadows. No longer. I stand with my sons at the bow of the ferry as the wind picks up and the waves rise, approaching a giant's round, stunned face staring wide-eyed across the water at the elegant and more presentable parts of the city. The city is our backdrop, is our foreground, a thing of sandstone and figs and beaches and glass and steel and cuts and canals, of terrace-lined streets crowded by the discarded usages of former times and by a distended real estate market. I wonder how they, growing up in the lee of the city, might come to a different sense of it than we did, as they splash in almost private beaches on ancient peninsulas, while behind them, over the constant blue, the bridge is heavy and insistent, a stark steel thing which Sydney wears to go out. I have my own experience, my own stories, some lived, others gathered up from the records of the past. But tonight I invite you to listen with me to these 12 stories of Sydney.
Hi everyone. Tonight I'm not going to talk about my personal story and history living in Sydney, but rather how Sydney fits into my story or worldview, essentially my relationship with the concept of Sydney. So my experience of Sydney has always been a love-hate relationship, which has not changed to this day. When I was younger, Sydney was simply that city across the water that I steered clear from. It wasn't until about 4 or so years ago that I discovered Sydney was a much larger region, which encompasses so many diverse and interesting suburbs that I enjoy learning about and visiting prior to certain recent world events. Even more recently, thanks in part to everyone's least favorite global pandemic, I've understood Sydney to be much larger than before. So my previous interpretation of Sydney as a single insular city arose from my fears when I was younger. Until I entered high school, my least favorite thing in the world was always crowds and crowded spaces. So I was kind of claustrophobic, except only around other people, not really spaces. As you can imagine, being a claustrophobic small child, the prospect of visiting such a bustling, loud, crowded space was my absolute worst nightmare. And because of that, I grew up hating the idea of the city of Sydney without actually having any negative experiences there. Interestingly, I'd been to other cities in Australia and had no real issue with them, but Sydney is just so close to home, and it always felt like a closer and more real threat, I guess. Also, I think the fact that I lived just north of the bridge and went to school within viewing distance of the city only exacerbated this. So after school, I put all my savings into living overseas for a while to escape Sydney, and strangely, I found myself really missing the city that I'd actively avoided until I left. Interestingly, the places I missed were really specific, like the quiet parts of the Botanic Gardens, the smells of the shops below the QVB, which is probably just lush and T2 now that I think about it, and my favorite pub, which is so dingy that people don't really go there, which is excellent and a true claustrophobe's dream. And before you ask, I will not tell you where it is because it's become much nicer, which is less excellent. I had this realization that even though the city is claustrophobic, loud and crowded, it has really pretty spots too, which are worth the stress of navigating the city to find them. So since I've been at the University of Sydney, I've also started to discover the reach of the city. And the best part about friends and family moving away from where I grew up is that I get a secondhand experience of all these amazing suburbs and regions of Sydney. And through them, I've found so much amazing food, culture, music, etc., that I wouldn't have otherwise found out about. So, for example, my girlfriend was living in Stanmore until very recently, and through simply going out for coffee or buying groceries, I discovered Leichhardt and Petersham, which are amazing places. The Italian Forum in Leichhardt is like stepping into a whole new world. And now I see Sydney for its little diverse sections within one whole that are perfect for exploring and hanging out once I'm allowed to go there again. So when lockdown ends, you might even catch me around the city, most likely in the park at Barangaroo or Observatory Hill, but only ever weird hours in the day when everyone's working. Speaking of lockdown, pre-recording this, I'm picturing now a collective groan through the Zoom audience. My spatial understanding of Sydney has also shifted recently when keeping track of where I can and can't go for a masked walk. Through looking at the maps of LGAs we see every morning all over the news websites, it has become clear that Sydney is massive. I feel like I've been so closed-minded to anything outside of this bubble I previously saw Sydney as. And if discovering the inner west has been such a eye-opening and amazing, colorful experience, I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to explore Sydney, but for real this time, the real, massive, chaotic, but pretty and friendly Sydney.
There is an idea that Irish people settle easily in Sydney. After all, we share the same language as Australians, and the Irish had a great influence on Sydney's culture. But while there is no doubt that language makes it easier for Irish migrants, it is still a very different country and environment. I grew up on the west coast of Ireland, close to the Atlantic Ocean, in a town called Sligo. We lived in the shadow of a mountain, Knocknarea. On top of this mountain is an ancient cairn, or grave, which legend has it is the grave of Queen Maeve, the legendary warrior queen of Connacht. It is certainly the grave of somebody important. To be laid to rest on top of a mountain that dominates the surrounding area means you're certainly not just anybody. We used to say in Sligo, if you can see Queen Maeve's grave, it means it's going to rain. If you can't see it, it means it's already raining. It was wet there, beautiful, but very wet. So coming from a small town in the west of Ireland to Sydney, it was very different in many ways for me. Like any migrant, I needed to find a door into Sydney. I was lucky enough to have a love of football, or soccer, as the Aussies called it to my dismay, and football provided me with one door into Sydney. I wanted to play when I arrived, and after a while, a friend of mine suggested I play with an Irish team called Phoenix Celtic, based in Coogee. At first, I was a little reluctant to play for an Irish club. I was not that keen on the idea of ethnically based soccer clubs. But I went along and trained, and quickly the friendship of my new teammates and the desire to play swept away any doubts. My teammates were certainly not all Irish. We had English, Scottish, Welsh, even a couple of Australians, not to mention the odd Colombian and a couple of French lads from time to time. Phoenix played in the State League at the time. This meant a lot of travelling all over Sydney. So I learned the geography of my new city, driving my old Toyota Corolla, my first car, to Parklea, to Windsor, Liverpool, or Bankstown, or St. Mary's, Manly, and up to the Central Coast. Usually there would be a teammate beside me in the passenger seat with the Gregory's A to Z street guide, navigating us through these alien suburbs. We found that Sydney was a place of winding roads, streets that seemed to wind back on themselves, sprawling suburbs, dead ends, and football pitches hidden behind service stations and schools. Certainly not a planned city. And when we did reach the grounds, we often found we played against other ethnically based teams. Lebanese, Jewish, Portuguese, Serbian, Croatian, Chinese, and Ghanaians, migrants and the sons or grandsons of migrants, and later on the daughters of migrants were playing as well. What we saw was that they, just like me, were finding their door into Sydney. We battled it out on the field. It was always competitive. Then shook hands at the end, and afterwards we shared a beer, and many times the hospitality of our opponents and their community. We enjoyed some new culinary delights, certainly tastier than the sausages and bread rolls we provided for them. Still, it's the thought that counts, and no one was there to swap recipes. I soon realised that my doubts about ethnically based football teams were wrong, and that these clubs in fact provided a huge support base for many of Sydney's migrant communities as they sought a new life in Sydney. These clubs represented their communities and gave them a sense of identity, a link to their old homelands, while they, like me, were finding their place in our new shared home in Sydney.
Sydney is the multi-fenestrated lens through which I began to see and understand the world. It's where I learned to crawl my way from toddler to adolescent and young adult. My Sydney story, our Sydney story, is contained within a multitude of buildings. those in which we lived and those to which we are mere transient visitors. I can point to my history on a map, give you a house number, and tell you how the air sat in my lungs in autumn. In my mind, I am still meandering through many different hallways, waltzing with the alacritous ghost of myself. There are still flowers sitting on the mantelpiece that my mum and I plucked from back lanes and quiet streets, and I am certain that on that mantelpiece, someone else's flowers still bloom. Buildings are filled with life, but it's not the provenance of wrought iron and stonework that interests me. What I want to know is what happened there, who lived there, when, why, and how the dust settled with succeeding occupations. We all impart our lives on buildings, leave some of ourselves behind in fingerprints and pencil markings and chips in the skirting boards, hidden unclean nooks inhabited by the detritus of yesterday. I remember the first time I heard the phrase, "if walls could talk." The idea fascinated me. Ever since, I wanted to take an archaeologist's brush to the city's many layers. I wanted to rest my ear against them and hear trapped whispers. Given the chance, I'd touch every doorknob in every old home, run my fingers along the dampening walls, down the balustrades, and then sit cross-legged on the floor, wrapped in sonder. That is the realization of the profound complexity of others' lives. It's my way of connecting with all of the people who've been there before me and attempt to become a part of an historical collage. In this city, rows of terraces stand like archives, ready to be pulled from shelves and dusted off. I could sit and sift through pages of personal papers until I appear on the parchment myself. The dilapidated houses are fascinating, and perhaps most filled with tender humanity. I am enthralled by their weeping spirits. It lingers, the sadness, smears itself across the window panes. My father took me to visit a house he was renovating a few years ago. Mustard yellow nicotine stains leached from the walls, grime covered the pale green sink, empty bottles formed a clinking colony on the floor, cabinets spewed newspaper clippings. I can recall gingerly taking one of the clippings between my fingers. It was a notice about the man who had lived in that home. He'd been arrested for driving under the influence. Tucked away in the adjacent bedside table was a book titled "Living with an Alcoholic." That house now belongs to a wealthy family. It's clean and shiny and painted over, the poster child for gentrification in Balmain. I often wonder if its new inhabitants ever feel the desperate despair that once tinged their walls. Would they love their home more for its historical characters, or would they add yet another coat of lexicon white to further distance themselves from its past? On the kitchen table of this Balmain home was an apple. Next to it, a rusty butter knife with butter that never met bread. A dead tableau, still life. It was as if whoever sat there had sublimated into the quiet darkness of a Caravaggio, waiting for the light to hit their canvas memory. In some way, this is true of all of our histories. If you look closely enough, the walls will tip you a wink. For me, buildings are living histories. They're so alive that when I put my hand to the wall, I entwine my fingers with another's.
The idea that ignorance is bliss is powerful, but in those cases where knowledge is painful, where it would destroy happiness, that it might be better not to know. It seems to me that here in this city, neither ignorance nor knowledge bring joy. Here is my story of Sydney. I am a Dharawal woman from the Gupich Bada clan. I was born and raised in a quiet town in Sydney's west. I always knew a little bit about my Indigenous heritage. At least I knew I was Indigenous, but I didn't exactly know what it meant to be Indigenous. It didn't change who I was or what I did growing up, but other people seemed to know more about what it meant for me to be Indigenous than I did. People had assumptions about me. I was either lying because I was too white to be Indigenous, or I was milking it for all I could because Indigenous people get free stuff, right? None of these ideas have ever been true. So where, I wanted to know, did it come from? For fear of having these comments made about me, to me, I stopped speaking about my heritage for a while. If anyone asked, I was just Aussie. I was never ashamed of my identity. It was just no one understood my identity. And with the little knowledge I had about myself, I didn't know how to help them understand. So I figured if I didn't say anything, no one could say anything to me. No one could make me feel uncomfortable, and no one could make me feel less than them. This was my ignorance, my lack of learning about my identity, my family's history, and the full history of Sydney itself. It wasn't that I was never curious. I simply didn't know where to start. Perhaps the hidden archives of Sydney's history is the city's ignorance too. My learning of Sydney's history was fragmented. My school dedicated very little time to the history of Indigenous people, either before or after the invasion. It was very much centered around the growth of Australia as a nation, its prosperity and strengths and contributions to war. In fact, I was taught that our modern nation took shape following a mostly peaceful settlement. While we did learn about the White Australia policy, the stolen generation, assimilation, and the dream time, I would argue, though not in enough detail. We didn't learn about the massacres of whole Indigenous tribes. We didn't learn about the Indigenous trackers who were left behind after the Boer War because they were denied re-entry into Australia. We didn't learn about Rottnest Island, a former Aboriginal prison with some 373 Aboriginal men now lie buried under a holiday destination, offering visitors a casual atmosphere, picturesque scenery, and a rich cultural heritage. These pieces of knowledge would come some years later, and so it was the settler history that helped me develop my view of Sydney as I grew. Sydney was always this grand city full of prosperity and growth and chance. I never stopped to think what the land was like before the British invasion, or how the Aboriginal peoples used the land, how they hunted and foraged and survived. Looking around the city today, this is no surprise. Any mention of Sydney's history might span back 100 years, 150 years, 200. All history dates from the beginning of the European presence of this land. What the city, its streets and infrastructure, its houses and factories used to look like, sound like, how they worked, who worked them, hundreds of thousands of years never mentioned. My journey to true knowledge about the history of this city began only 5 years ago, and it still continues. Perhaps it won't ever stop. Most of it came from my own desire to know. That was when I learned about the Apin massacre, ordered by Governor Macquarie, a man known to be a perfect gentleman, according to the plaque on his statue in Hyde Park. My great-great-great-great-grandmother was one of 3 survivors of the Apin massacre. 2 years ago, my family found photos of her son, and her nephew. Why it took so long, where they came from, I will never know. Like so much of Indigenous history, perhaps it was lost or buried. I learned about the slavery that did in fact happen in this country, both Indigenous peoples and convicts. I learned just how harsh the conditions were for the stolen generation, and I learned that the stolen generation never really came to an end. That Indigenous people are still disproportionately removed from their families because people still don't understand the Indigenous traditional way of life, and that the wounds of families torn away from the state never truly heal. I can still appreciate Sydney's beauty on its face, but I am no longer ignorant about its past. I know how this beauty has been made, and I know what has been lost, what has been stolen.
I haven't been in Sydney for long, only for about a year and a half. My Sydney story follows about the same timeline as the COVID-19 pandemic, which means I have spent all of that time over here in the inner west of Sydney. My Sydney story is a relatively shorter one, but nonetheless an honest one, as I come from an unfiltered, fresh perspective. When I first arrived here from the capital city of Malaysia, I had no doubt that I was going to love the city. It had sunny weather, multicultural food, and diverse celebrations. It was enough like home, but in other ways, it was so very different. I must have taken thousands of photos of the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House, and I loved looking out at the blue-green of the ocean on all the coastal walks. However, as I immersed myself deeper into this place, I realized that there was still a potent us versus them mentality, lurking not so far beneath the surface of the open, friendly Australian way of life. I had come to Sydney to study at the University of Sydney, but even in this global university, I've had friends experience alienation and exclusion simply because they speak English with a foreign accent. I thought that this was only something that happened back in the 1960s, when my also Malaysian grandfather came here to Sydney to study at the University of Sydney. He was rather proud that I was coming here to the same university and showed me his yearbook. He studied engineering and he was one of the top scorers in his cohort. But among the messages I saw that his classmates had left him was, "We wish him luck when he returns to industrialize the Arabs." Surely things will have gotten better over the last 60 years, right? Well, I'm not sure, but COVID-19 definitely didn't help. I was checking out my groceries at Aldi in Broadway Shopping Center one morning when a man cut the queue in front of me. He turned to me and said, "Oh, sorry, I should have queued up. Don't want you turning into a tiger like those ones back in China, right?" He proceeded to roar and mock me. People around me looked uncomfortable, but no one stepped in. I just calmly told him that I was not from China, and this shocked him and he left quickly. I was lucky that this did not escalate any further. However, after this incident and hearing about other multiple hateful crimes and assaults on Asians in Sydney these past few weeks, I no longer felt comfortable walking alone outside, not even in broad daylight. I started getting paranoid about taking public transport, always worrying about what I would do if someone were to attack me. Even walking outside as a group with my other Asian friends had me on edge, as I believed that as a group we attracted more attention, which meant more possible altercations. For me, the pandemic really exposed the underlying racism still prevalent in this country, alive and hateful in this city. Not only against Asians, but against other minorities, especially the Aboriginal community. I was shocked to learn that there were still so many Aboriginal people still dying in police custody, and no one seemed to be talking about them. I have only just arrived here. There is still much of the city's physical landscape, culture, and history yet to explore and experience. I look forward to the end of the pandemic and what the city will continue to offer me over the coming years. Thank you.
I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people on whose land I wrote this book, Sydney Spleen. Thanks to James for having me. I would like to read 3 poems from the book tonight, all about Sydney and all with some historical themes. And the first one is called January 26. In the newly landscaped park of the bougie suburb we'll move away from in the next few years to solve our very material problems, leaving friends behind, we hold a picnic for our first daughter's first birthday on the nearest weekend to the actual day, failing to realise that this park in particular has been set aside for the crowds, the families in neurotypical relish, segregated beneath Moreton Bay figs, the morning sun flaring off girding terraces, the green and gold jumping castle, the boys in blue huffing into balloons, the heat that has even skeptics talking climate, bushfires, the conflation of colour that could turn to riot if everyone didn't just queue up to swallow the same authentic cuisines as at any other fete, weathering the peels of another pile of ARIA nominees. And yes, most of my friends don't turn up because it's that date again. And each time round, this endeavour seems more designed to fail, transporting us to where we were destined to be. From the moment a race with pale skin dropped anchor and shook the sandstone, struggling and still unsure of learning how to start over again, how to walk this back, uninvite ourselves from this hot, manicured parkland, then navigate home through a capital ablaze with idols of our own making. The next one is called 17 Great Dog Shits of Sydney, and it is, it's named, and kind of the idea came from a painting by Brett Whiteley called The 15 Great Dog Pisses of Paris. A couple of things I should note before I read this one. The first line is a poem in itself, a 3-line poem, very short one by Michael Dransfield, which goes, "I was flying over Sydney in a giant dog, things looked bad." And the last line is from another poet called Elizabeth Riddell. In between those 2 lines are those 17 great dog shits of Sydney as I outline them. So it's a kind of list poem. And I'll just tell you about a couple of them quickly. So Barren Field, was a governor in colonial New South Wales. It's still colonial New South Wales. But he wrote the first book of colonial poetry, or printed the first book of poetry in Australia, so-called Australia, and the book was called First Fruits. So you'll mention that, you'll hear that. And if you don't know it, that sculpture in King's Cross, which is like colloquially named Poo on Sticks, is called Stones Against the Sky. So you'll hear about that one as well. All right, 17 Great Dog Shits of Sydney. I was flying over Sydney in a giant dog. Things looked bad. The First Fleet had dropped anchor and Baron Field had unloaded first fruits, thus avoiding himself of attacks on Terra Nullius. There'd been a rum rebellion, the grog bog, a symbol of progress, and the Queen was back from marking her territory on 57 towns in 58 days. The UTS Tower building appeared as a vertical log some square god had pushed out while the sporting chicken of John Forbes's bicentennial poem shat itself in Martin Place upon decapitation. The 100 plus kilograms of the world's largest burger were competing with Leichhardt's quarter of a kilometre of pizza. Mr. Whippy was doing the rounds. Shock jock diarrhea dribbled from the radio and the NRL got embroiled in a poo in the shoe snafu. Stones Against the Sky was plopped atop King's Cross. A 12.4 metre puppy left a soiled bouquet at the MCA. Then onion-laced Abbott became special envoy for Indigenous affairs. After Scotty's dirty stop out at Engadine Macca's, Barangaroo just rubbed it in. Every night, some crusty white cop in Hyde Park pinches off a loaf for the statue of Cook. Now all the dogs with folded paws stare at a glowering sky. Yeah, and then the last one I'm going to read is slightly longer, and it is called Dust Red Dawn. There have been a couple of large dust storms that have come through Sydney in the last decade or so, and they're both mentioned in this. This one takes place during the second, slightly less red one. And Evie is, who's mentioned in this poem, is my eldest daughter. Dust Red Dawn. Can you convince the wind to change direction? The Opera House dishes in their rack are browning again. The government wants them whitewashed by massive shock jock endorsed horse racing ads. It's nearly summer and November's going loopy. The sky turns ochre, orange to some amid purple greys. Depends on the screen you see things through and whether or how you recall the dust red dawn of 2009 that loomed over the Blue Mountains from the southwest like something sci-fi. How it crept in the early hours into the city in slow motion, the way a red container ship now glides as if on ice over choppy waters under the harbour bridge. Today's another scary fire day. People are out and amongst it, spending everything on Christmas, dealing with the trauma of a year's overload. The sun's not a sphere, it's a funnel that sucks the world's energy up like a vacuum, spits it back out in shards of light or in hard slabs of heat the size of continents. Wind drags dust from inland out through the heads, country in its teeth. When the dust red dawn dwarfed Sydney, it was much redder than this orange-grey haze people are dissing on the tweets like it's nothing, like there aren't still tons of it settling on every windowsill. Millions of airborne specks turning sinuses to rage. As a 2-year-old, Evie was afraid of specks, couldn't comprehend them. She used to point and scream at any tiny fleck invading her bath time and space. They were alive, could morph into other forms. Or maybe she understands them too well, how our bodies are always morphing. She's been watching Alice in Wonderland, a big girl now, not a dot inside a tummy anymore, and difficult to allegorize given our background in colonial poesis. The sound of an invisible cannon shot thunders and echoes from the sandstone and concrete beneath the bridge on the northern side of the harbour, dragging me back to the steering wheel I've drifted off behind on the southern side as I take a break from deliveries. 20 more bangs go off, and with each, a further 20 echoes are delayed by what seems 200 years or more. Sky turns maroon. Through the windscreen, a dirty rainbow. On the road, red is caked in the puddles of this morning's rain shower. How do I talk to my daughters about all the tiny beliefs being part of the big ones, about tipping points that have already been breached, about the version of history they'll inherit that can't go back to time immemorial and that'll probably soon completely cease reverberating through the future's waters. The car shakes. Wind lifts the sedan, spinning me up to the palm tree canopies, and for a moment, we're all doing helicopters. Fronds, hair, car, heads, arms. I imagine my daughter's airborne too, dispersing dust, trying to shake it off. I return to land, watch the specks we picked up get whisked over Cadigal and out to sea, tiny flecks of red and black subsumed back into the ongoing fallout and wash up.
For me, Sydney is sandstone. I know that's a cliched way to talk about Sydney, and I also know that, at a different level, this is a strange way to think about a city. Why sandstone? Sandstone, or rather its sediments, is how I think about history. Layer upon layer, stone upon stone, story upon story. History, and all its stories, will get piled up, buried, unburied, reburied, repeat. Or maybe it's because I've lived in an 1883 sandstock semi in Summerhill my entire life, apart from the 7 months we spent living down the road while our 1970s gully kitchen was being renovated. Living in the inner west, sandstone, or at least its cheaper cousin sandstock, is ubiquitous. For the record, sandstock are those little yellowy rectangle bricks of sandstone that were commonly used to encase colonial edifices. Think Hyde Park Barracks, or think Summerhill. I pass sandstock squares every time I walk or run around the suburb's skinny streets. Sandstone, to me, is familiar. Sandstone reminds me I am home. It's everywhere in our city. My dad grew up in the southern suburb of Peakhurst Heights, and yes, there is sandstone there as well, although it's well disguised under the oval-shaped backyard pools and 1970s yellowy red houses that swamp the suburban streets. Where my mother is from, though, there is no sandstone. She grew up in Bathurst in the Central West, an area home to red brick, brick coloured by the rich soil of gold and pastoral land. It's beautiful, but it's not sandstone. It's not Sydney. But my mum found sandstone when she ventured to Sydney University to study education in history and English in 1986. She found there a beautiful cliché, a sandstone quadrangle set up on a slope above Sydney. I'm following her story, studying education in history and English, taking a tutorial in one of the sturdy wings of the lovely old cliché. But I haven't come from Bathurst. For me, the quadrangle is just 20 minutes down Parramatta Road on the 413, or 50 in peak hour. Sandstock to sandstone in 20 minutes. Sandstone is a porous rock. My family share a fear that one of these East Coast lows will simply wash away our semi-skeleton. But it remains. It survives in the shape of our house and the neighbouring buildings. I continue to view its yellowy hue. Primarily of late, this viewing has been from my extended walks around the Cooks River during our lockdown. My best friend Ellie lives in the 1841 sandstone sugar mill, since turned into apartments. The mill, as we fondly call it, stands as a shadow of colonial expansion along the Cooks River, its 4-storey yellowy hue electing reminiscences of 19th century industrialism, a rather Dickensian anachronism. I've been enjoying going to wave to Ellie from the walking track below. Sandstone lines this walking track, although it can sometimes go unnoticed as the smell of rotting mangroves can make one track hastily along. And there are other distractions. For the past 6 months, there's been a constant drilling of in my neighbourhood, which brings me back to Sydney, back to history. A constant clawing up and setting down of road tar, a layering of cables, renovated houses, renovated streetscapes. Steady reminders that our city's sandstone skeleton is constantly being unburied and reburied, unclothed and reclothed. There are 2 words that have the sound story. A nice homonym for my purposes here, since in a dense human place like a city, like this city, stories are laid down in the ground and then built up into stories of meaning and memory. Layer upon layer, stone upon stone, story upon story. Sydney is built on a bed of sandstone, and much of it is built from sandstone. I'm talking to you in a room made of sandstone, in a house made of sandstone, in a suburb built of sandstone, in a sandstone city. Sandstone is made up of sediments, and so it seems to me that Sydney, the sandstone city rising from a sandstone bedrock, is a city built from the sediments of human life, built from stories. This is just a little grain of mine.
Snaking down the dark, overgrown lane parallel to my street, I meet Canterbury Racecourse. I enter the parking lot where I spent joyful hours practicing roller skating and much more miserable hours learning to drive. I'm still far better at roller skating than driving. To get to the Cooks River, I would walk, run, cycle, or roller skate through the paved driveway area, traverse carefully over the grassy, unpaved section, dodging racehorse poo, and through a tight gate into the back streets of the Cooks River. I enter the river at Lees Park, near a tennis court and soccer or cricket field, depending on the season. From Lees Park, I have 3 options, depending on where I'm headed. If I'm going to the ice rink, I turn left and cross the river near Canterbury Swimming Pool, a heavily chlorinated pool sitting in stark contrast to the dirty brown river. If I'm going to Campsie Library, I go straight, crossing the river immediately and guiding my way through the quiet back streets of Campsie until I reach the bustling hub of activity, Beamish Street. Takes me past the station, past where I once lived, and to Campsie Library. The newly, or not so newly now, renovated library is ample with study tables, multilingual books, and this peculiar sort of wallpaper at the entrance that is pictures of fake books. Finally, if I'm going to the mud crabs, I turn right towards Croydon Park, where weeding events take place, or I turn left if I'm participating in a rubbish cleanup. The Mud Crabs is a community group that organise cleanups and bush regeneration projects along the river. Many of the volunteers have been living on the river for years, and a few tell my friends and I about how they swam in the river as a child, something that seemed so unimaginable to us, given its current state, done as we were pulling bindies out of a regeneration site. Now might be a good time to pause and give those unfamiliar with the river a little bit of context. The Cooks River runs from Yagoona to Botany Bay, although the depth, width, and cleanliness of the river depends on where you are. The part of the river I'm familiar with is home to entanglements of dumped share bikes, stories of three-eyed fish, thousands of dollars worth of 10-cent bottles, gallons of brown mud, and my cousin's shoe, which got stuck in the mud when he slipped into the riverbank, and a stench which can only be described as a mix between rotten eggs, bird poo, and dirt. I hope I'm selling the Cooks River to you. I've twice ridden from Canterbury to the end of Botany Bay, past many lovely historical sites if you look close enough. So there's the old sugar mill in Canterbury, which was built in 1841, on land noted by colonisers as low and marshy, where Indigenous people fished on the river, living harmoniously with the land for thousands of years. After the sugar mill closed, other industrial works continued to pollute the river, including wool washers, tanneries, and boiling down works. Cycling along the river and seeing the never-ending brown water, these effects are clear. The tree clearing and damming that took place in the 19th century contributed to the erosion and destruction of the riverbanks, which have been stabilised with concrete and constructed river walls. Closer to Botany Bay, there are market gardens, many of which were set up by Chinese migrants in the early 20th century. Some of these gardens are still in operation, but many are overgrown and no longer functioning. My time spent travelling along the Cooks River has made me acutely aware that public space and access to waterways is important for our quality of life. I no longer live near Canterbury Racecourse or travel along the river frequently, but without a doubt, the Cooks River is an essential piece of public space in Sydney, increasingly being eroded by the long-term effects of pollution, climate change, and the interests of developers. I'm sure it's very different to the place Indigenous people once fished and lived off.
I think these legendary lines are a fitting start to my Sydney story, as my life is literally a tale of two cities. A riveting adventure of back and forth, of contrasts and comparisons, and of duality between parallel yet interweaving lives. My birthplace, Dhaka, the bustling capital city of Bangladesh, and Sydney, my sanctuary and my home, the city that nurtured me and feels more real to me than any other place that I've known. I first met Sydney in 2007, Back then, I was 5, a young, scrawny kid who had just migrated with family into a whole new world. We settled in Arncliffe, a cramped and bustling suburb near Rockdale, with a predominantly Lebanese Australian population, a lot of whose kids I actually went to the same primary school with. But more importantly, Arncliffe was a short 15-minute train ride to the University of Sydney, where my parents were undertaking their postgraduate studies at the time, and where my story will eventually and undeniably loop back to, with me as a current USIS student. But to this day, I carry vivid and colourful memories of my pre-adolescent years, stammering through my first English words in kindergarten to delivering public speeches in front of the whole school by year 4. We lived in a teeny 2-bedroom apartment on Queen Street, which, though small, had a magnificent view of the blue city skyline from the balcony. Most Sundays, that distant, hazy horizon would become tangible as my family took advantage of the Sunday Funday fairs, and we'd take the train to Circular Quay to sit by the harbour. Regardless, my chapter at Arncliffe came to a dramatic close after my family and I flew back to Dhaka in 2011 with a truckload of books and articles and thesis papers flying behind us. My parents still lug those around everywhere. One of the downsides of living in a family of academics is that there's never any storage space in the house. So there's always some random pile of books or bundle of papers in the garage that don't belong there, but I can assure you that no one will ever throw them out. Ironically, I feel that in Dhaka, my relationship to Sydney was the strongest. Memories of Sydney became nostalgic, and I remember comparing the always alive, noisy, and spirited urban life of Dhaka, one of the most populated cities in the world, with the relatively subdued and low-key urban life in Sydney. I remember comparing the celebrated monsoon season with the lack of one in Sydney and contrasting the humid and sticky summers of Dhaka with the hot, dry 40-degree summers over here. When we returned to Sydney in 2015, again, my outlook on life had changed. I was older, had been exposed to my Bengali culture, and could now evaluate Sydney with a fresh set of eyes. High school was interesting. It was difficult to adjust to at first, but eventually I figured out the key to good grades, made lifelong friends, and realized my love of teaching, which I'm currently undertaking as a degree in university. We settled in Minto, a quiet residential suburb tucked away in southwestern Sydney, where I'm still living and from where I have to make the hour-long trek to university, although that's not the case right now, of course. University is where I can relive the city vibe and where I truly feel that I'm experiencing Sydney. Moving back and forth between 2 very different cities throughout my life has been stressful, challenging, but so rewarding. Not only has my outlook of the city changed, but my journey between cities has changed me. I know that's cheesy, but I had to include that. I feel empowered to have the ability to compare Sydney with other places and have an insight and appreciation of the city that I wouldn't have had I not been exposed to other cities. I'm definitely a city girl through and through, and even though I wasn't born here, Sydney is definitely my home. Thank you.
I was born to Fijian parents who migrated to Australia in the late 1980s. I was born and raised in a southwestern Sydney suburb called Liverpool and only recently moved to Campbelltown. Growing up in southwestern Sydney, my friends and I were exposed to the disheartening prevalence of crime within the area I lived in. It was really common for us to hear the police sirens echoing through the streets as breaking and entering and theft crimes were the norm. Only recently was my best friend's cousin's murderer finally convicted of the crime that only occurred a few streets away from my high school. Although it was sometimes really disheartening to constantly see Southwest Sydney in the news for these crimes, this was only one side of my experience of Sydney as a child. On the other hand, I was able to observe the predominant vibrant multiculturalism which is almost synonymous with Southwest Sydney. Not only did I get the chance to gain a closer connection to my own Fijian Indian heritage, I also gained an appreciation for the cultural diversity which was heavily visible throughout my upbringing and schooling career. Southwest Sydney is just one of those places where you could walk down the dodgiest alleyway and find the best noodle shop of Cabramatta, or you could just completely immerse yourself within the diegetic yelling from the kitchen of a kebab shop in Bankstown. It was a rare occurrence that my family would ever visit the Sydney CBD or the Eastern Beaches. As a result, I do recall a bit of an apprehension to leave the familiar southwestern Sydney streets to pursue my tertiary education in the Sydney city. Despite this apprehension, ironically, I was able to experience Sydney City only when I was truly alone. I remember so clearly on the first day of my university orientation, I exited Central Station the wrong way out and ended up in the complete opposite direction I was meant to be going. My Google Maps wouldn't connect to my current location. It began to rain and it was strangely cold for a March morning, and I was completely exhausted. Despite the suffocating anxiety I felt being lost in an unknown place, once I gained my bearings, I began to appreciate my newfound freedom as I explored brand new places alone. Despite this sense of liberation and freedom whilst journeying the streets of Broadway, during my first year at UTS studying a Bachelor of Business, I couldn't help but feel a sense of simultaneous inclusion and exclusion. Growing up in the suburbs where community and family were paramount, it never really occurred to me that people who grew up in other areas of Sydney would have no clue what I'll be talking about if I talked about a place from my area, which was made perfectly clear when I would receive ghastly looks of confusion whenever I shared where I was from while at university. Although I felt included within this community of university, I felt excluded from the classes of students within my tutorial class who all grew up in the same district in the lower North Shore. Feeling like an outsider, it was difficult not to compare myself to the apparent easiness and security of these students, simply because we came from different sides of Sydney. However, in saying this, I did feel a strong connection to my identity of growing up in the southwestern suburbs, as curious peers would inquire about my experiences of growing up in one of the most dangerous suburbs in the state. My experience of Sydney thus far has been challenging yet fruitful. I believe that there's still a vast amount of Sydney which I'm yet to experience, which intrigues the question, will my Sydney story forever remain the same, or will it constantly change contingent upon my perception of the ever-changing Sydney city? Thank you so much for listening to my story.
Living in 5 cities growing up means that you're inevitably asked which one you like the most and why. I never give a favorite. However, Sydney does have an important part on that list. It's the city I've spent the most time in, the city I've lived in 3 times, and the city that always seems to pull my family back. And every time I've lived elsewhere, I'm reminded of how far Sydney is, how isolated we are down here. But because my Sydney story is a 21st century story, Sydney has always been connected to the rest of the world, and distance has never necessarily isolated us. This reality means that my story of migration is so different to family stories of migration that precede mine. Take my dad's story of moving to Sydney from the Netherlands, motivated by a stagnant Dutch economy that had yet to recover from World War II. In preparation for this, I called my dad and asked him why his parents chose Sydney over Canada or the British colony of Rhodesia, which is now known as Zimbabwe, both of which were on the list. Sydney, he said, promised a sense of adventure and the welcome idea of living in a place where it wasn't perpetually overcast and rainy. Sydney is 17,000 kilometers from the Netherlands. And that distance has not changed. Yet at the time, Sydney was further. A weeks-long boat journey through the Suez Canal, stopping in Yemen and Fremantle. And as soon as years of paperwork culminated in 4 tickets on the Johan van Oldenbarneveld, bound for Sydney, my grandparents stopped speaking Dutch at home. I found the arrivals paper for my dad and his family, and the names on there were not the names that I've grown up with. My Oma, Jantje, became Jenny. My dad's father, Marinus Cornelius, became Max, and my uncle became Reen. That long, 17,000 kilometers meant that parts of their Dutchness were left behind on the journey, and a new identity emerged at each stage, forged as they left the Netherlands, as they disembarked the ship at the Skyville migrant camp once they arrived. But that moment of receiving those 4 tickets marks not only the end of one stage of life, but also marks where my family's Sydney story begins, as thousands of others have. In fact, the Johan van Oldenbarneveld carried the 100,000th Dutch migrant bound for Australia in the post-war period. Arriving in Australia, Dad says that they built their life around the physicality of what was there. Even if life was not easy at the beginning, purpose could be found through the sheer beauty around them, in the sun and surf at Narrabeen Beach. In my life, Sydney has always been knowable, a flight or a call away. Yet many Sydney stories began with an imagined city, built in one's mind, bolstered by slivers of a distant relative's anecdotes, with no real knowledge of what would await you down under, with the belief that you were leaving home for the other side of the world, that yours was a one-way ticket. Many Sydney stories began in a world where my story of coming and going, of return ticket after return ticket, was unfathomable.
At 20 years old, after returning to my home in Noosa on the Sunshine Coast from an overseas trip to Egypt, Jordan, and India, I spontaneously decided I was going to move to Sydney. I remember my mum's reaction as I only gave her a couple of weeks' notice. Sorry, Mum. I packed my car and drove all the way south. I will never forget my first experience of the crazy traffic coming into Hornsby as I headed to Gladesville in the inner west. Now, this wasn't actually my first experience of Sydney. My first experience was when I was 19 years old and completed a 10-day voyage on the Young Endeavour tall ship, which departed from Sydney Harbour. This ship was actually given to Australia by the British government in 1988. Myself and the other youth crew got to climb the 32-metre mainmast as we sailed underneath the Sydney Harbour Bridge. I've now lived in Sydney for 3 years and am currently living in Clovelly with my partner Adam, and I feel I've really been exposed to a whole new world and that I've seen a lot of Sydney in such a short period of time. And from this exposure, I know just how unlimited the stories and perspectives of Sydney are. Before attending the University of Sydney, I lived in Parramatta while I studied my first year at the University of Western Sydney. Having this experience of studying at 2 universities really exposed me to how multicultural Sydney is and the different ethnic pockets that it contains, especially for me in comparison to Noosa. My job with the music bus has taken me to a significant amount of suburbs, such as the Sutherland Shire, Blacktown, Northern Beaches, and Penrith. Furthermore, my partner and I have done a lot of camping out in the Blue Mountains, and we also paraglide at the Blackheath Lookout. I've heard a lot of the naval stories of Sydney as my partner is in the Navy, and he actually once attended a really cool cocktail party in the military tunnels under HMS Watson, the naval base. I've also climbed into those old tunnels that are down near Bear Island whilst hiking on the coastal track. Now for some of my family history. My great-grandfather, Ben Johnson, left his family home in Wellington, New South Wales when he was 14 years old to start his apprenticeship as a fitter and turner at the Garden Island dockyards in 1921. He joined the Queenscliff Surf Lifesaving Club and became involved in one of the greatest rescue dramas in surf lifesaving history. It became simply known as the Bronte Epic in 1931. During World War II, one of my great-grandfather's major engineering achievements at Garden Island Naval Dockyards was the construction and installation of aeroplane catapult braces on the heavy cruisers HMS Australia and HMS Sydney. I was very excited about this family history because my partner Adam, who is a lieutenant navigating officer in the Navy, is actually posting to the brand new HMS Sydney 5 in December this year as the navigating officer. After leaving Garden Island, my great-grandfather and his family owned the fish and chip shop at Bronte, where my grandmother grew up, attending Randwick Girls High School. My grandfather Douglas was a student at the University of Sydney, when he met my grandmother, who was a student nurse at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Camperdown. While a student, my grandfather lived at Wesley College and my grandmother completed her nursing training at Ryde District Soldiers Memorial Hospital at Eastwood. My great-great-grandfather, William McGuffick, became a well-known identity at the district that exhibits at Royal Sydney Easter Show, where he would construct the wool section for the Central Coast and Tablelands exhibit. He was involved in these exhibits from 1906 until 1948. These district exhibits are still a major feature of the Royal Easter Shows. My grandmother, as a student at the Randwick Girls High School, was also a member of the Mass Girls dancing team that performed at the Sydney shows in the 1950s. Thank you very much.
As we finish, I wanted to honor and thank again these students for sharing their stories. It was brave of them to share in tutorials, so much braver to share with all of us tonight. The theme of History Week this year is from the ground up, and these stories have met that theme in different ways. All history comes from the ground up. Urban histories are especially vertical, with human experience in the city stacked upon itself, like the steel and stone of the buildings. Someone pointed out that the further up from the ground we get, the less connected we are to the soil. The soil is the great connector of lives, writes Wendell Berry, the source and destination of all. It is the healer and restorer and resurrector, by which disease passes into health, age into youth, death into life. Without proper care for it, we can have no community, because without proper care for it, we can have no life. Or in the words of Australian farmer and writer Elaine Mitchell, once a city has grown beyond the size adequate for necessary trade and communication of ideas, it becomes a drain on the land that supports it. Children grow up who never know that beyond the concrete and bricks and bitumen, there exists the living earth, and beyond it, implicit within it, the living universe. But in a country where 3/4 of people now live in cities, we need to believe that the city has some life in it, that it can afford some kind of integrity and connection and community that is more than human. We need to believe that in the city too, we can find connection with the earth, because otherwise, as Mitchell warned in 1946, we'll ruin the earth that supports us, the soil which is more than ground, more than a place on which to build human things of meaning and beauty. One way to do that is to tell stories of the city, which is to tell stories of ourselves, people of the city. Thank you very much for joining us tonight in a time of stream fatigue. Thank you to the History Council, the Department of History at the University of Sydney, and to Rebecca Hibbard and Julianne Robson and Peter Adams for their help pulling this together. Good evening.